Hi, it's a pleasure to have you here. Subscribe to the channel and comment which city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Emily Carter, I'm 29, and I live in a tiny third-floor apartment in Boston, tucked behind the red brick charm of Beacon Hill, where the windows let in more dreams than sunlight. Every morning I walk to the public middle school where I teach art, holding my coffee like a shield and my sketchbook like a promise. I chose this life, simple, purposeful, sometimes lonely, but filled with color and stories that only children can paint. I believe in quiet strength, in building futures with patience, not privilege. And though my hands are often stained with charcoal and hope, I never imagined they'd be the same hands that would rip apart a wedding dress hours before walking down the aisle. After 3 years of long dinners, whispered promises, and elegant weekends between Boston and Connecticut, Ethan Reynolds got down on one knee on a foggy afternoon in Martha's Vineyard, surrounded by the Atlantic's hush and a ring that sparkled like a vow. He said I was the missing piece to his perfect life, and I believed every word. I remember how the wind played with my hair as he held my hand, how his eyes looked steady, certain. I said yes without thinking because love should feel that simple. And for one perfect moment it was. From the moment I put that ring on, I threw myself into wedding plans with the kind of joy I hadn't felt in years. Tasting cakes, picking dresses, booking a vineyard in upstate New York that looked like it belonged in a magazine. I ignored the little hesitations, the subtle glances Ethan gave when I spoke about wanting a smaller ceremony or including my late parents in the program. Everything seemed beautiful, polished, full of promise. But beneath the lace and smiles, something fragile was forming. Something I chose not to see. Until it cracked wide open. It was late, my hands still dusted with makeup swatches and seating charts, when my phone buzzed with a message that sliced through my calm like a blade. My mother wants to see you tonight for dinner at our house. No question, no explanation, just a command dressed as an invitation. I stared at the screen for a full minute, my chest tightening with dread I couldn't quite name. She had never reached out to me directly before. And yet I knew, this wasn't just dinner, it was a test. I sat on the edge of my bed, the quiet of the room pressing in, and felt a cold knot twist in my stomach. Every encounter with Mrs. Reynolds left me feeling smaller, like she could see through every inch of me and find only flaws. She smiled with her mouth but judged with her eyes, and her words always came laced in silk and poison. I told myself it was just nerves, that she was trying in her own way. But deep down I knew I was walking into a room where love had no seat at the table. I remembered the first time I visited their Greenwich estate, how the marble floors echoed under my cheap heels, how her eyes scanned me like I was an applicant, not a guest. She'd offered me wine and compliments that stung more than silence. A teacher? How noble, she had said, glancing at my chipped manicure. Every word was calculated to remind me that I didn't belong. And Ethan, always polite, never interrupted, as if discomfort was the price of admission to his world. One afternoon during a charity brunch, she leaned toward a group of pearl-draped women and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Ethan has such a big heart, even for girls from modest backgrounds." The table laughed and I smiled like it didn't matter. But it did. That sentence clung to me for days, replaying in the quiet of my apartment and in the echo of classroom bells. She didn't just disapprove, she pitied me. And somehow that was worse. Still, that night I stood in front of the mirror and chose a beige dress, soft, safe, unthreatening. Applied a light touch of makeup, and pinned my hair the way Ethan liked it. I told myself to stay composed, to rise above, to be the version of me she couldn't tear down. I took one last look at myself and whispered, "Just dinner. Nothing more." But my reflection didn't look convinced. I wasn't walking into a home. I was walking into an arena. The roads to Greenwich were smooth, lined with trees that wore their wealth like fur coats. And as I passed through the private gates, the guard barely nodded, his eyes blank with practiced indifference. I parked beside Ethan's polished BMW, my little Toyota looking like an intruder. The mansion loomed ahead, tall and perfect, with windows that hid more than they revealed. I sat in the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, willing my heartbeat to slow. Then I stepped out, heels clicking like a warning. The door opened before I could knock. Mrs. Reynolds stood there, dressed in a dark blue gown, her diamonds subtle but unmissable. She tilted her head, her smile sharp as glass. "Right on time, how professional of you," she said, stepping aside with the grace of a queen granting an audience. The hallway smelled like roses and control. I forced a smile, walked in, and felt the door close behind me like a verdict. This wasn't dinner. This was war dressed in velvet. The dining room shimmered with silver, crystal, and a kind of cold perfection that felt curated for intimidation. Ethan stood to greet me but didn't reach for my hand, his eyes darting from me to his mother like he couldn't decide which world to belong to. The table was set for 4, but every detail screamed that I didn't deserve the 4th chair. I sat down slowly, my napkin trembling slightly as I placed it on my lap. The silence between greetings felt louder than any insult. "So, you teach in a public school? How admirable," she said, her voice drenched in that delicate sarcasm that cut deeper than outright disdain. She didn't even look at me as she spoke, choosing instead to adjust the angle of a silver fork like it mattered more. I smiled politely, swallowing my pride like a bitter pill, and nodded. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing, his silence louder than her words. In that moment, I knew she wasn't trying to know me. She was measuring me. "I assume there's a prenup?" she asked, lifting her wine glass with the casual menace of someone used to controlling outcomes. The room chilled, even though the candles still flickered warmly. She didn't wait for my answer. She already knew it was signed, sealed, and tucked into one of her lawyer's safes. Ethan cleared his throat but avoided my eyes, and I felt like I was being carved out of my own engagement. It wasn't about love for her. It was about lines she didn't want crossed. "Yes, there is," I said, steady, even as my pulse pounded in my ears. Her lips curved slightly, satisfaction flickering in her eyes like victory. "Oh, good," she replied, slicing her steak with quiet force. "It's refreshing when a woman like you understands her limits." The words burned, but I held my ground, refusing to let her see even a flicker of pain. If this was her test, I was not going to fail it with tears. I turned to Ethan, waiting, hoping for him to speak, to say something that would cut through the cruelty and remind me that I wasn't in this alone. But he stayed quiet, eyes glued to his plate, fingers tensing slightly around his knife. His silence didn't just disappoint me, it betrayed me. In that moment, I saw the boy who feared his mother more than he loved his fiancé, and that hurt more than any insult she could ever craft. "Will your parents be there tomorrow?" she asked, tilting her head like it was a casual inquiry, not a dagger. I took a breath, held it, and replied, "No. They passed away." The room stilled for a second, but not out of sympathy, just curiosity. She nodded slowly, as if checking something off a list. I braced myself for what would come next, but I still wasn't prepared. "Oh, that's so sad, though in a way simpler. Fewer people from less refined circles," she said, her voice sweet as sugar, her meaning sharp as acid. I blinked, stunned, unsure if I'd really heard her correctly, but her smile confirmed it. The cruelty wasn't accidental, it was designed. Robert shifted awkwardly, and Ethan looked like he might speak but didn't. I swallowed the ache and stared straight ahead, refusing to cry. Robert gave a strained chuckle, the kind that tries to smooth over a wound without ever addressing it. Ethan forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. I clenched my napkin under the table, the lace scratching against my skin like a reminder to stay composed. Such a charming woman, I thought bitterly, my jaw tight. This wasn't just dinner, it was demolition. A waiter approached with red wine, hands trembling slightly as he poured, and just as he reached my glass, the bottle slipped, a splash of burgundy landing right on my dress. Gasps echoed around the table, and I instinctively reached for a napkin. But before I could react, Mrs. Reynolds let out a soft, pleased sigh and said, "Well, that's what happens when you're not used to fine dining." I froze, stunned by the delight in her voice. She wasn't hiding it anymore. Ethan excused himself to take a call, and as soon as he left the room, she leaned slightly toward her husband and whispered in perfect, effortless French, "Ellen and I classe and I elegance and I avenir. Mon fils mérite tellement mieux." The words hit like a slap, sharp, fluent, deliberate. Robert didn't respond, but he didn't look surprised either. They weren't just judging me, they had already written the ending. What she didn't know was that I understood every word. I sat still, hands folded, a perfect mask over a storm of fury. She didn't know I had lived in Paris during my junior year, that I had studied Degas in his native tongue and cried in the Louvre. Every syllable she whispered burned down my spine, but I didn't flinch. Her mistake wasn't just insulting me, it was underestimating me. And something shifted inside me that moment. A quiet, cold resolve I hadn't felt before. She turned her head slightly, just enough to murmur another line in French, her voice a velvet blade. Spiritual pleurer de la première facture. The audacity of it. Mocking me as weak, unprepared, disposable, while smiling across the table like nothing had been said. My chest tightened, but I didn't move, didn't blink. Let her think I was deaf to her venom. I wasn't, I was memorizing every word. And then came the last strike, the one she couldn't take back. On dirait une fille de province d'Agassiz and Marie. A small-town girl playing dress-up. A charity case wrapped in satin. She chuckled under her breath, sipping wine as if she had just made a witty observation. My jaw tightened, but my eyes stayed calm. Ice over fire. She thought she'd broken me, but all she did was reveal exactly who she was. My fingers trembled slightly under the table, nails pressing into my skin to anchor me. I kept my breathing even, refusing to let my expression betray the storm building inside. Dignity was my last shield, and I held it high. Let her have her insults, her whispers, her false superiority. I wouldn't let her see me fall apart, not tonight. He walked back into the room, casual, smiling like nothing had shifted, like the temperature hadn't dropped 20 degrees in his absence. "Everything okay, babe?" he asked, placing a light hand on my shoulder. I turned to him and smiled, my voice calm. "Perfect." He didn't notice the ice in my tone, or didn't want to. He sat down, blind to the war he'd missed. Mrs. Reynolds lifted her glass, her diamonds catching the candlelight. "To everlasting love," she said sweetly, her eyes locking with mine, daring me to flinch. I raised my own glass with steady hands, my lips barely moving as I whispered, "To clarity." We clinked glasses, porcelain smiles on porcelain faces. The toast wasn't to love, it was to endurance. The plates were cleared, the candles burned lower, and the silence grew heavier with every passing second. I stood heart steady now and grabbed my coat from the back of the chair. Mrs. Reynolds leaned in and kissed my cheek, a cold brush of power disguised as affection. "Good night, dear. If you still feel like getting married tomorrow." Her words fell like a challenge. I didn't flinch. Something inside me snapped. Not with anger, but with precision. I turned back to her, took her hand deliberately, and met her gaze without fear. My voice was calm, controlled, even kind. For the first time that night, I wasn't defending myself, I was delivering a message. She didn't know yet that the game had changed. I smiled softly and said, "Bonne soirée, madame. Et merci pour vos precious conseils de mariage." Her fingers stiffened in mine, the color draining from her face as the words registered. It wasn't just the language. It was the realization that I had heard everything. She had tried to humiliate me in secret, but I had chosen to respond in public, with elegance sharper than revenge. She froze, eyes wide, her mouth slightly parted, not in shock but in fear of exposure. Robert blinked, confusion giving way to understanding. Ethan looked between us, clueless, sensing tension but missing the cause. The room held its breath for a second, Like even the walls knew something irreversible had happened. I didn't wait for permission to leave. I turned, walked to the front door, and let it shut behind me without looking back. The crisp air outside hit my face like truth, bitter but cleansing. I waved off their driver and got into my car, the leather seat cold under my trembling body. As I started the engine, I felt lighter and heavier all at once. I was driving away from more than a house, I was escaping a lie. Halfway home, the weight of the evening crushed me. I pulled over on an empty street, hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. And then it all came out, the humiliation, the anger, the disbelief. Tears streamed down my face faster than I could wipe them away, the taste of salt sharp on my lips. I screamed into the silence, alone but finally honest. Somewhere inside, a part of me broke, and another began to rebuild. Back in my apartment, I sat in the dark, the city lights flickering across my wedding dress like ghosts of a future I no longer wanted. It hung there, flawless, untouched, mocking me with its innocence. 6 hours until the ceremony, and I hadn't closed my eyes once. I thought about Ethan's silence, his mother's words, my own voice in French cutting through their cruelty. By dawn, I knew exactly what I had to do. The sun rose pale and distant, turning Boston's streets into mirrors of frost. I made tea but couldn't taste it, my body running on something colder than caffeine resolve. The wedding dress lay folded across the chair, still waiting, still perfect, still wrong. My heart no longer raced, it steadied. It didn't feel like running away, it felt like waking up. My phone started buzzing before 7. Ethan's name flashed again and again, his messages piling up with a mix of confusion and panic. Where are you? Mom's worried. The guests are waiting. Each one sounded less like love and more like control. I stared at the screen unmoved. I had already spent too long answering questions that only served other people. I turned off the phone and placed it face down on the counter. The silence that followed heavy but liberating. There would be no ceremony, no vows written under someone else's approval. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of disappointing anyone. I was finally protecting myself. And that felt sacred. I called the florist first, my voice calm but final. Cancel everything. Then the caterer, the photographer, the venue, each call another thread cut clean from a web I no longer wanted to be caught in. The people on the other end hesitated, confused, maybe even pitying, but I didn't explain. I owed no one a story that wasn't theirs to tell. Freedom doesn't need witnesses. I folded it neatly, the fabric soft under my fingertips, still smelling faintly of lavender and dreams. A few tears slipped down, staining the white silk like quiet memories. It wasn't just a dress. It was everything I had believed in until last night. I placed it gently in the box, closed the lid and whispered, "Goodbye." Some goodbyes don't need to be loud to last forever. The phone rang again, a different tone, a different kind of venom. "Emily," her voice hissed, sharp even through the distance. "Don't make a fool of yourself. No decent man will want a girl like you after this." I listened without breathing, the coldness in her tone almost impressive. She wasn't angry because I had left. She was angry because I had chosen myself. Her power didn't work outside her mansion. I waited a second before answering, making sure my voice came out calm, not broken. I'd rather live with dignity than with someone who lets me be insulted. There was a pause, a faint gasp on her end, surprise, maybe disbelief. I didn't give her time to recover. "Goodbye, Mrs. Reynolds." I hung up before she could respond. The silence that followed felt like applause. For the first time in days, the world was completely still. No phone, no voices, no demands, just quiet. I sat by the window watching snow begin to fall, small flakes landing on the glass like fragile truths. I wasn't angry anymore. I was empty, peaceful, untethered. The silence didn't hurt. It healed. By noon, the news had broken. Not just within their circle, but beyond. Bride runs away hours before high society wedding, blared across gossip sites and local headlines. The story twisted into something dramatic and shameful. Photos of the vineyard, the cake, the empty chairs, everything published like proof of a disaster. Strangers whispered, critics speculated, but none of them knew the truth. I wasn't running away. I was walking toward myself. A Boston paper ran a photo of me leaving the apartment days earlier. Hair in a bun, groceries in hand, no makeup under the headline. The teacher who said no to a millionaire's son. They made me a symbol I never asked to be, brave to some, reckless to others. Students' parents gossiped in whispers at school pickup. I avoided eye contact in public. But deep inside, I preferred this discomfort to the suffocation I had left behind. I shut myself away for 3 days, unplugged, unwashed, untouched by time. I didn't answer the door, barely ate, barely slept. Grief came in strange forms, not for losing Ethan, but for the version of myself I had been pretending to be. I cried harder than I expected, not because I regretted the choice, but because I finally understood how close I had come to betraying myself. Some freedom feels heavy at first. On the 4th day, Sarah, my colleague, my rock, showed up uninvited, holding coffee and fire in her eyes. "You didn't lose him, Em," she said, pushing past the door. "You escaped." I broke into tears in her arms, the kind of crying you only do when someone sees you without judgment. She didn't ask for details. She just sat with me until the silence didn't feel so cruel. I went back to work the next Monday, nervous, expecting whispers, but instead I got hugs. My students surrounded me with messy drawings of hearts and stick-figure brides. "We missed you, Miss Carter," one whispered, pressing a crayon sketch into my hand. It was clumsy and perfect. The classroom, loud and imperfect and full of love, reminded me who I really was. This was my world, not Greenwich, not their rules. One morning, about 2 weeks later, I opened my mailbox to find a thick envelope addressed in elegant cursive. The sender? Robert Reynolds. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, unsure what to expect. A warning? A bribe? Inside, a short handwritten letter. It wasn't cruel. It was human. I know what my wife said that night. I heard every word. The letter read. And I said nothing. For that, I am deeply ashamed. He didn't defend her, didn't justify the cruelty, just acknowledged it. He ended with, "Not everyone in this family is as cold as we seemed. I hope one day you find peace far from us." I reread it twice, unsure whether to feel gratitude or sorrow. Enclosed was a donation check made out to my school's art program. More money than we'd ever had in our budget. I stared at it for a long time, the ink still crisp, the name heavy with history. I didn't cash it. I sent it back with a thank you note written from my heart, not my pain. But the tears that came after? Those were real. Not for the money. For the rare glimpse of decency. Months passed and the headlines changed. Ethan's firm went under after a risky development project in Miami collapsed, taking investors, including his own family, down with it. The Reynolds name lost its shine fast. Real estate circles turned cold, creditors circled like vultures. Ethan disappeared from public view. I watched from a distance, no bitterness, only clarity. Some silences come back to haunt you. I heard whispers that Mrs. Reynolds had sold parts of their Greenwich estate, auctioned off art, let staff go. She bailed Ethan out, barely, but in doing so, she lost the very social standing she had built her life around. Her name no longer opened doors. Her smile no longer silenced rooms. Everything she had used to hurt me was now slipping through her own fingers. 3 years later, I was walking through a gallery in Soho during a weekend trip to New York, lost in a haze of oil paintings and soft jazz playing in the background. My life had changed, calmer, fuller, quieter, and I rarely thought of Ethan anymore. But as I stood before a bold canvas of fractured reds, I heard a voice behind me, familiar, worn, hesitant. "Emily." I turned slowly, already knowing before I saw him. Ethan stood there, older, paler, thinner, his hair touched with gray, his once confident eyes weighed down with regret. He looked like a man who had lived through loss, not just of money but of certainty. "You look," he started, but his voice cracked. I gave him a soft smile, not cruel, just distant. Time had rewritten everything. "I wanted to apologize," he said, eyes on the floor, voice barely audible over the gallery's quiet. "Not just for that night, but for every moment I didn't speak up." I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch before answering. "You don't need to," I said gently. "I've already forgiven myself for loving you." He blinked, unsure if it was a compliment or a cut. "I did love you, Emily," he whispered, as if the words still mattered. I met his eyes steady. "I loved your son, but I couldn't love his silence." He didn't argue. He just lowered his head. There was nothing left to fix, only something to finally close. We shook hands like old classmates, not former lovers, and in that touch I felt the weight lift. There was no anger, no spark, no ache. Only a door closing softly behind us. As I turned to leave, I felt the past finally settle, not as a wound but as a chapter. I didn't look back. Neither did he. I moved into the next room, still absorbing the moment, when I saw her. Mrs. Reynolds, sitting quietly near a landscape painting. Her once commanding frame now still in a wheelchair. Her posture was upright, but her face was older, softer, almost fragile. She hadn't seen me yet, and I debated walking past. But something in me needed more than silence. She turned slowly, as if sensing my presence before I spoke. Her eyes widened, not with arrogance, but with something closer to fear. "Emily," she whispered, her voice no longer cold but cracked by time. I stepped closer, calm, composed. This time I wasn't the girl in the beige dress. I was the woman who had survived her storm. "I didn't know you spoke French," she said, her voice trembling like a confession. I met her gaze, steady and kind. "And you didn't know that a woman with dignity understands more than she lets on." She blinked rapidly, the air between us heavy with things unsaid. I wasn't there to punish her. I was there to let it end. Tears welled up in her eyes, not theatrical, just quiet, aged, real. "Please forgive me," she said, the words slow and foreign on her tongue, like she hadn't used them in years. I looked at her, the woman who once tried to unmake me, and saw only a shadow of who she'd been. I nodded once, not with pity but peace. Some victories don't require applause. I walked out of the gallery into the late afternoon sun, the light warm against my skin, the breeze softer than I remembered. There was no music, no dramatic goodbye, only clarity. I felt no hate, no triumph, no need to look back. I had entered that building with history on my shoulders. I left it free. I stepped into the sunlight outside the gallery, not as the woman who had walked in, but as someone finally whole. The past no longer clung to me. It had been acknowledged, faced, and released. I didn't feel victorious or vindicated. I just felt light, like someone who had survived a fire and no longer smelled of smoke. Peace isn't loud, it's quiet and complete. 2 years later, I opened an art school in Boston for underprivileged girls. A place where creativity meant freedom, not escape. I poured everything I had into that space. My time, my experience, my story. Each paintbrush handed to a child felt like rewriting my own history. I wasn't trying to fix what had been broken. I was building what no one could take away. Finally, my life belonged to me. Sometimes when I stay late at the studio, cleaning brushes and locking up, I think about that dinner. About the lace napkin on my lap, the taste of cold wine, the weight of silence. That night didn't ruin me. It revealed me. It didn't end a love story. It ended an illusion and began everything real. One afternoon, a shy student tugged at my sleeve and whispered, "Miss Carter, I want to be like you." I looked at her, all eyes and hope, and smiled without hesitation. "Then never let anyone make you feel small," I said gently, "no matter how rich they are." She nodded like it was a secret, not advice. And in that moment I knew I hadn't just survived. I had become someone worth becoming. That night, I walked home through the quiet streets of Boston, the city humming softly under autumn skies. The leaves crunched under my feet like tiny reminders of how everything changes, not always loudly, sometimes just by surviving. I thought of all the versions of myself I had shed to get here. The pleaser, the dreamer, the girl who stayed silent at someone else's table. I no longer belonged to any of them. I had earned this life by choosing it, not waiting for it to be handed to me. My apartment looked the same creaky floorboards, same chipped paint near the windowsill, but it didn't feel small anymore. It felt sacred. It held the woman I had become, the choices I had made, the strength I had claimed without screaming for it. I didn't need a new address to feel powerful. I just needed peace, and I had finally made space for it. Some nights I still dream of that vineyard. White chairs, lace runners, champagne flutes that were never used. But I don't wake up crying. I wake up grateful that I never stepped into a marriage built on silence and strategy. I was never meant to become someone else's ornament. I was meant to become my own foundation. The world moved on as it always does. New headlines replaced the old. New weddings took place on the same lawns where mine was meant to unfold. But I never felt left behind. I was ahead in the only race that ever mattered. The one where I was finally running toward myself, not away from discomfort. And that race had no audience, just purpose. Sarah and I still meet on Friday nights. Sometimes we drink wine, sometimes tea, but we always toast the same thing. To the girls who walk away. It's our quiet anthem, our small revolution. We don't need anyone to understand the weight of that choice. We just know what it means to have made it and survived with grace and tact. The art school grew slowly, then suddenly. One scholarship turned into 5, one classroom into 3. Girls who had been told they were too quiet, too messy, too invisible started showing up early and staying late. Their paintings weren't always pretty, but they were bold, honest, alive. I didn't teach them how to draw. I gave them permission to take up space. Sometimes I sit in the back of the studio, watching them with charcoal-stained fingers and fire in their eyes, and I wonder what kind of woman I would have become if no one had tried to shrink me. Then I remember. I became her anyway. Not in spite of them, but beyond them. They lost the power to shape me the moment I stopped seeking their approval. I never saw Ethan again after that gallery. Part of me thinks he was waiting for one more chance. But he never reached out, and I never looked back. That final handshake had said everything that needed saying. Closure isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just the quiet knowing that someone no longer lives in your heart. As for Mrs. Reynolds, I never learned what happened to her estate, her staff, or her reputation. All I know is that when we met that final time, the sharpness in her had dulled, not from defeat but from realization. That's enough for me. I didn't need her apology to heal, but she needed to give it to finally see me. And I let her. This is the story I carry now, not of a wedding that never happened, but of a woman who saved herself before anyone else had the chance to do it for her. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 35. I live in a tiny apartment above an art school I built with my own hands. And every morning I walk into a room full of girls and remind them, softly, fiercely, that the only love worth having is the one that begins with yourself.